Yes, now we are approaching the next section of our panel with a lecture of Mr. Petr Macek. I hope that I have spelled it rightly. Dr. Petr Macek is an associate professor at the University of Hradec Králové. That means Hradec Králové is a city in Czechoslovakia, yes? Okay. And participates as a research fellow in the project Trinitarian Ontology of the Human Person at the Catholic Theological Faculty of the Charles University in Prague. His main research area includes Catholic social philosophy, especially the dialogue with Marxism. Okay, if we could calm down the noise and then we could start. It's up to you now. Welcome, and we are looking forward to the future.
So good afternoon, and thank you very much for a kind introduction and for the invitation to the conference and for all the previous illuminating and very inspirational talks. And in my short presentation, I would just add a little footnote to what we have been discussing here today. And I would like to talk about the possible implications of Trinitarian ontology for our social and political thinking. Okay, so I will try to start. Since personal being is the highest mode of being, the most perfect expression of what it means to be, to quote Jesuit philosopher W. Norris Clarke, a Trinitarian ontology is obviously deeply immersed in the reflection of the mystery of a person.
Sorry, could you speak a bit louder?
All right.
Okay, thank you.
This regards not only the inconceivable mystery of the divine persons of the Trinity, but also its created analogue, the human person. A Trinitarian ontology thus points to the summit of the creation, to the human beings who are invited to the supreme participation in the eternal dialogue between the Father and the Son in the power of the Spirit of the gift. A Trinitarian ontology is indispensably also a Trinitarian anthropology, as I think was depicted also in the previous presentations in this panel. In my paper, I will focus on the specific aspect of the human existence, its social dimension. Not only, as it is notoriously reminded, is man a distinctively political animal, but it seems to me that the question of a social order represents one of the most pressing questions of our contemporary times. If late modernity, or if you will, Western society, as it emerged from the world wars and from the experience of totalitarianism, preoccupied itself with the existentialist problem of the authenticity of the individual human being and strived to protect individuals against any kind of ideology. Our contemporary situation shows the burning and urgent need for the renewal of common life in community and society. You can observe this trend, for instance, in the growing discussion about the recent transformation of liberal consensus and the emerging of post-liberal thinking. The question of freedom is more and more accompanied with the question of identity, as I think it was addressed yesterday in the keynote lecture of Archbishop Williamson. Has a Trinitarian ontology anything to do with these problems of freedom and identity? The social dimension of this theological and philosophical school of thinking stands out clearly at the end of the Klaus Hemmerle programmatic text, Thesis towards a Trinitarian ontology. However, it's my aim in this paper to present work of another theologian. I will focus in the following minutes on the work of Ctirad Václav Pospíšil, probably the most important and the most prolific author in the field of systematic and Trinitarian theology in current Czech Republic. I will briefly present the basic foundation of his thinking and subsequently his approach to the indicated questions of freedom and identity in society in the light of Trinitarian theology and Trinitarian ontology. And it's also my aim to present a little bit the Central European tradition of Trinitarian theology and the Trinitarian thinking. Okay. Ctirad Pospíšil was born in then Czechoslovakia in 1958. In 1977, he entered a clandestine community of the Franciscan order and received the name Václav. Because of all official activities of religious orders were strictly prohibited by the communist regime, Pospíšil completed his formation and initial studies in illegal underground communities while working as an electrical engineer and a male nurse. After the fall of communism in 1989, he studied in Rome and graduated in 1995 as a doctor of theology. Since 1996, he has been working as a professor at the theological faculties in Olomouc, Prague, and České Budějovice. This brief biographical note may offer a necessary framework for the following exposition of social and political thinking of Professor Pospíšil. As a social and political thought is never a matter of purely speculative thinking, but rather a practical application of abstract principles. Life experience, in Pospíšil's case represented by his encounter with the totalitarian regime, plays a crucial role in shaping of his approach to political and social issues. The reason why we should pay our attention to the work of Professor Pospíšil is not only external or superficial. It's not the fact that he is the author of major theological tracts currently used as standard manuals at Czech universities. It is rather the content and spirit of his texts that command attention. The pivotal theme of the whole of Pospíšil's work is a renewal of theological thinking in the light of Trinitarian theology, in the light of Trinitarian mystery. And in this regard, he follows in the footsteps of the restoration of Trinitarian theology as such, as it might be witnessed in the last decades of 20th century and at the beginning of new millennium. But it's crucial for the purpose of our paper that the aim of Pospíšil's method is not only to contemplate speculative depths of mystery of the triune God, but also to show the importance of the Trinitarian doctrine for our understanding of the reality of the world we live in. Hence his focus on the theology of history and theology of creation. Through the discussion on these points, Pospíšil gets close to the topic of Trinitarian ontology. Although his explicit remarks on this theme are rather sparse in the pages of his monographs, it is obvious that he thinks about a Trinitarian ontology as a unique means how to bridge deep paradoxes encapsulated in the experience of human existence. Quote, only a Trinitarian ontology that is in the same time personal and dialogic is able to overcome the contradiction of unity and plurality. Coming from a theological rather than a philosophical perspective, Pospíšil, on the other hand, repeatedly emphasizes a certain primacy of the faith that is simultaneously embedded in a perichoretic relationship with the reason. To quote again, the faith in God therefore returns to ontology, which is consistently inside life, experience, spirituality, and therefore is in principle simultaneously something practical. In a word, only a reflected faith is able to breathe life into ontology and existentialize it. So to use the categories of Professor Roeg, I would say that Professor Pospíšil belongs rather to the theological philosophy than philosophical theology. Okay, so in this brief introduction, I wanted to emphasize three important elements forming Pospíšil's thought. Firstly, his consistently Trinitarian approach to theology. Secondly, his comprehension for the importance of proper ontological rootedness of both theology and philosophy, yet accompanied by an awareness of the inadequacy of purely natural theology and philosophy, which must be nurtured by the experience of faith. And thirdly, his experience with totalitarianism that leads to his comprehension of the prophetic role of the theology that might and should serve as a guardian of freedom and true transcendence. Okay, so now let's discuss the first point of freedom. Our current political situation might be described as a tension or struggle between liberalism, which embodies a modern notion of freedom as an emancipation from any given social, cultural, or even natural fact on one hand, and the politics of identity, focusing on a common, mostly cultural identity. Pospíšil addresses in his text both of these tendencies, carefully avoiding a trap of mechanical correlation between our idea of God and the structure of human society. He is well aware, on one hand, that, as was mentioned above, Trinitarian orthodoxy must lead to Trinitarian orthopraxy. In his own words, quote, Trinitarian social theory represents a privileged bridging between Trinitology and true Trinitarian spirituality and practice. On the other hand, he constantly highlights the danger of the divinization of our own social and political models and structures, the trap of projection of our social and political theory to heaven. as was, for instance, accurately formulated by theologian Karen Kilby. Quote, projection then is particularly problematic in at least some social theories of the Trinity, because what is projected onto God is immediately reflected back onto the world, and this reverse projection is said to be what is in fact important about the doctrine. The mystery of the Trinity thus should not serve as a justification of our social theories, but rather as their purification. If the true meaning of social theory of the Trinity is purification of our political and social conceptions, then it finds its proper expression in the idea of freedom. Freedom is for Pospíšil a proper and fundamental articulation of the position of man amidst the creation, and the true freedom of God, his supreme transcendence to the world, constitutes a true root of this freedom. The detailed presentation of Pospíšil's theology of creation lies outside the scope of our paper, but it is important to note this close relation between his social thought and his contemplation of the Trinitarian theology of creation. Only the consistently triune God who creates the world ex nihilo might guarantee the true freedom of man, and this specific conception of freedom lies at the heart of any proper political freedom. It is becoming evident that in Pospíšil's thinking, freedom is conceptualized more as a protection against any ideologization, which Pospíšil recognizes as a modern form of idolatry, than as a mere emancipation of man from unsatisfactory social structures, as freedom is usually understood in modern liberalism. In his exposition of political meaning of the Trinity, Pospíšil proceeds to a certain extent from the tradition of modern political theology, founded in a discussion between the German political theorist Carl Schmitt and the theologian Erik Peterson in the 1930s, without explicitly mentioning Schmidt's importance for this discussion. Pospíšil adopts a line of reasoning initiated by Peterson's influential essay Monotheism as a Political Problem, and later developed especially in the work of another German theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, which is highly critical to any legitimization of the current political structure of the society through religious ideas and conceptions, especially the tendency to legitimize the rule of one, monarchy, on the basis of strict monotheism, which ultimately and consequently links monotheism with totalitarian form of government. Pospíšil argues in accordance with Peterson, Moltmann, and many others, quote, whereas strict monotheism potentially represents a religious justification of central and absolute power, then a consistently conceived Trinitarian model of the dialogic God, who is a community of essentially interdependent persons, will lead to a society built not so much on power, but mostly on consensus, dialogue, respect to authority, therefore to the modern forms of democracy. On the other hand, Pospíšil is well aware of the limits of such an approach, as they are expressed in the aforementioned article by Kilby, to quote again, an emphasis on the unity of God, on the oneness of God who stands apart from, over against the world, would arguably be used to undermine as well as to legitimize hierarchical and absolutist form of government. Pospíšil therefore asserts, quote, that the negative consequences of strict monotheism is necessary to take only as a possibility. And he even speaks about the danger and the temptation to legitimize, even divinize the current democratic order of the world in the name of the Trinity. Seemingly, the mystery of the Trinity stands out as a protection against any kind of idolatry when anything intra-worldly is presented as a man's ultimate goal. Whereas our political and social life is necessarily influenced by our conception of the divine and our idea of Godhead, it is prudent to be suspicious of any form of political religion, even if, and perhaps because it proclaims at its final aim total human liberalization and emancipation. Therefore, we can conclude this brief overview of Pospíšil's approach to the idea of political freedom with this quotation. Quality of this freedom depends unequivocally on the ability of people not to be enslaved by the idols of today's world, that is, both by those ideologies that are present in democracy as a result of human weakness and sinfulness, and by those that, as totalitarian models of solving social problems, are incompatible with democracy. But is it enough to contemplate a relationship between social order and the mystery of the Trinity only through a prophetic via negationis? Does it only represent a warning pillar of fire in our pilgrimage in the desert that protects us against the temptation of idolatrous political religion? Or does it give any positively defined identity? As I have indicated above, the question of identity has become one of the most pressing and discussed issues of our time, and it seems that the term identity politics is one of the main weapons in our contemporary culture wars. So can Trinitarian theology and ontology offer any help in this situation? It seems to me that Pospíšil is well aware of the horror of the void caused by the opening of space of the unlimited possibilities. Christianity in his eyes is not simply an emancipatory power that liberates us from the bonds of worldly structures, but it bestows specific and concrete identity. Although in one place he warns against the loss of Christian, Catholic, or Czech identity in the tangle of contemporary cultures, his approach is far from any simplistic, ethnocentric, or nationalistic deformation of identity. Therefore, it represents, in my view, an essential complement to this discussion on freedom. Our identity is in the first place the Trinitarian identity, to quote Pospíšil. Our freedom, at first experienced so joyfully, loses ground and sinks into even greater horrors without the eternal fatherly and motherly you, and without the awareness of extraordinariness of the gift of every moment of one's own existence, as it was clearly demonstrated in the last century that was marked by the greatest denial of the action of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not only in the world, but especially in ourselves. Or more plainly, the deepest ontological and theological layer of our identity is given through the experience of relationship with the Father based on our participation in eternal sonship in the power of gift whose name is Holy Spirit. This is the foundation of a proper understanding of identity, which does not stay in juxtaposition to the cultural identity, but deepens it and forms an essential corrective of all false idols that could be elevated as an ultimate good. As we occupy ourselves in this short presentation in the first place, not with the fate of the individual person, but with the collective level of social and political life, it seems suitable to attach several notes regarding the identity of collective social and political bodies. According to Pospíšil, the identity of large collective bodies, or in his words, collective persons, is sustained not only through the linguistic, historical, and cultural tradition, but through the deepest theological roots. In his typical dictum, not only the individual person, but also the supernaturally constituted collective person with him the salvation history is woven in the bark of Trinitarian love. When he speaks about such collective persons, he does not refer only to the tradition of ancient Israel or the tradition of the Church, but he specifically mentions traditions of the European nations constituted not only on the natural level, but to a certain extent born in and through the Church of Christ. Their identity is not only a national or cultural identity, but, to quote, the identity of the nation born within the Church of Christ is in short derived from the covenant and participation in the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Because even the identity of the collective person is given to this collective person from the others, primarily from the persons of Trinity, secondarily from human persons that transcend themselves in freedom and create national community. Unquote. Such a collective Trinitarian identity lies in sharp opposition to any kind of closed nationalistic identity. To quote again, this is something quite different than the identity of a collective person of nation perceived as non-Trinitarian, and therefore crippled and caricatured in the sense of a false idea of absolute person, an egocentric subject that is bound to false monotheism of a single person, and at the end leads to nationalism, chauvinism, racism, and war. According to Pospisil, the remedy to social illness lies not in the constant transcending and abandoning of identity, but in the recovery of its Trinitarian roots. Quote again, should these nations lose definitely their faith, their relation to the Father in the Son and Spirit, therefore the supernatural guarantee of their identity, what will happen to them? Okay, and several concluding remarks at the end of my presentation. So it has been my aim to illustrate through these short remarks the mutual dynamic relationship between the freedom and identity of persons in society, as presented in the work of Czech theologian Václav Pospisil. So we could contemplate on one hand the revelation of the mystery of the Trinity as the force that protects political community from self-divinization, from closing in on itself, and as the force that ultimately opens it up to the freedom that can lie only in the real transcendence of the triune God. On the other hand, this freedom, which is ultimately the freedom regarding the relationship with the other, the freedom regarding alterity, is not a mere formal and external instrument for eternal and aimless transformation or self-realization of human spirit. It is fundamentally rooted in the actuality of the gift of the Trinitarian love. It is the identity of love bestowed on us that calls us to answer it in an authentic and creative way, even in building our political and social structures. In other words, we can see the dynamics of the ontology and the action, the identity and the growth, or as it was eloquently expressed by Klaus Hemmeler, if, let us repeat it, love is what endures, if to move away from oneself is to move towards oneself, if to relinquish one's essence is to inaugurate it, then the indemonstrable, apparently mutually exclusive poles belong to each other without being collapsed into each other. And finally, as Pospisil reminds us, it is ultimately the revelation of the Word of God, Jesus Christ, the truth of the history, in which we can start to understand the depths of the ontological pole of identity given in the incarnation, in the relationship with the pole of history and openness to eschatological freedom given in the mystery of the cross. Okay, so that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Macek, for your inspiring, instructive paper. And now we are looking for the next online or digital lecture from Matt Williams from Durham University. I would like to introduce first, and then, okay, you directly can start. Matthew Williams is a doctoral student in the Department of Theology and Religion at the Durham University. His research interests focus on New Testament studies, particularly the Gospel and Letters of John. And the topic of his lecture is Karl Rahner's, of course, symbol and Johannine Trinitarian Ontology. So this will be the next online lecture, and now I hope that we can start soon or immediately. Hi.
He is.
You can just start right now. Could you say something, please? No, I can't remember. Well, yeah, I think, Mr. Williams, you have to try to go out and check your microphone connection again, if it's the right one, as you come back into the room. Could you do that, please?
Okay.
Now I can hear you, yeah.
And you can see me?
Yes, we see and hear you. You can start now. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation, and it's especially a privilege for a non-theologian to be speaking about a German theologian in Germany. So I should really watch what I say. But I want to talk today about Rahner's symbol and Johannine Trinitarian Ontology. Now, nobody would doubt that the theological richness of John's Gospel is profound, but few would turn to it for a viable socio-political vision. And what's attractive, certainly to me, about the new Trinitarian Ontologies project, NTO, is its commitment to formulate ontology as something that's practiced and lived and not simply conceptualized. Right from John Milbank's opening address in 2019 onwards, there have been frequent reminders not to allow theological speculation to become unmoored from praxis, and we just had that in our previous paper. So I argue in this paper how Johannine thought itself, when read from the ontological purview that Karl Rahner's theology of the symbol provides, is actually no less geared towards praxis than NTO itself, which in turn, as an endeavor, can be animated by careful attention to this New Testament text. So Rahner's understanding of symbol is encapsulated in a short, though inevitably dense, essay from the late 1950s, Zur Theologie des Symbols. In it, Rahner attributes the symbol an indispensable role at the heart of his theological enterprise. Moreover, however far a symbolic theology explicitly permeates his other writings, this brief piece can be said to represent something of a microcosm of Rahnerian thought. I know it will be familiar to many, but it's still worth sketching out the main argument. So Rahner opens with the premise that the concept of symbol is much darker, harder, and more polysemic than the everyday use of the term symbol. Symbol in German, or Zeichen, would suggest. What is needed is a more thorough analysis of the concept, which Rahner conducts by expanding 6 propositions, Sätze. Together, these show how the symbol is foundational, not just in understanding God, but in understanding all of reality. Very briefly, these propositions affirm that being, grounded in the Trinity, is plural, it's proposition number 1, due to the fact that being only is through self-expression in another, which Rahner identifies as the symbolic operation itself of the real symbol. That's proposition number 2. Thus, symbol is a key concept for theology as a whole, proposition 3, and God's salvific deeds are present to the world as symbol, proposition 4. With regards to anthropology, the body is thus the symbol of the soul, proposition 5, and each individual part of the body entails the whole, proposition 6. Now, Rahner's theology of the symbol offers, in nous, a Trinitarian ontology, just as Klaus Hemmel's theses do. It should already be apparent as well that his Trinitarian ontology has certain characteristically Johannine accents. But I want to go further and say that Rahner's essay can serve as the impetus for a fresh reading of the gospel text, yielding a Johannine Trinitarian ontology that, in turn, pushes back against Rahner in significant ways. Now, before proceeding with this reading, I should clarify what I'm not doing here. I'm neither evaluating Rahner's thinking on symbol in terms of its philosophical coherence, nor its congruity with the rest of his oeuvre, yet alone its relation to the tradition. Rather, the accent of this paper is how Rahner can help us read John in a new way. So the first part, looking at Rahner's theology of the symbol as a Johannine Trinitarian ontology. However indirect Rahner's engagement with biblical material may be elsewhere, one does not need to read between the lines to find the Gospel of John in Rahner's theology of the symbol. The key statement is that the menschgewordene Logos ist das absolute Symbol Gottes in der Welt. It hardly needs translation. This is a near paraphrase of John 1:14, the Word became flesh, and it implies a somewhat inverted reading of the prologue's opening, as we'll see. But he actually grounds it not in the prologue, but he grounds this affirmation in Jesus' later words from the farewell discourse, Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Because of this, Jesus' humanity does not obscure his divine identity. On the contrary, the incarnation is the epitome of God's symbolic self-expression. Ontology, as NTO is concerned with it, is concerned not only with the being of God, but with how divine being shapes reality in toto and our perception thereof. Likewise, Rana makes the passage from a symbolic account of intra-divine nature manifest in the Logos to a cosmological frame. And again, he uses a specific text in John to make this passage. Explaining how John's being is determinative for the character of created reality, he argues that the creaturely finite external expression, i.e. the cosmos, is a continuation of the intra-divine subsistence through the Logos, based on John 1, verse 3. Now, how exactly this relates to a scientific description of non-human creation in terms of atomic or molecular relations, or the kinds of things that we've heard from Beck, is not explored by Rana. Rather, his concern is what this means for human relationship to God. And regarding this, he is clear that the materiality of mundane experience is no barrier to participating in divine life. Quite the contrary, in fact. There's an ontological necessity in the continuity between A, the symbolic expression of Father in the Son, B, the Logos as being the ultimate symbol of God in the world, and C, the Church continuing the symbolic function of the Logos through the sacraments. Now this, of course, assumes some congruity between Jesus' life in the Gospel of John and the Church's sacramental practice, and that will take some arguing. But before we get that far, we need to take a more critical look at Rana's reading of John 1 verse 3. Does the statement made in the Gospel that all things came into being through the Logos really imply such continuity between divine being, incarnation, and ecclesial, for which we may read socio-political relationships? Well, Rana certainly makes no attempt to justify his interpretation on exegetical grounds, as you may imagine. However, the logic of his position depends on tacitly assuming two things about John's theology. Firstly, he assumed that in John there's no spiritual/material dualism that corresponds to the distinction between divine and human. Accordingly, salvation would not in any straightforward way be a matter of crossing a substantial divide, such as may be suggested by the oft-quoted phrase, "It's the spirit that gives life, the flesh is useless." Indeed, this particular phrase is often decontextualized in a way that obscures Jesus' insistence in a preceding discourse in John that his physical body, eating his flesh, is essential to people's receiving eternal life. And quite generally, the ontologically dualistic interpretation of John is a product of a later imposition compounded by another decontextualized phrase, the spiritual gospel, and it's not inherent in the text's own rationale. So I think Rana's assumption on this is fair enough. But even granted that there's no dualistic boundary to cross between divine and human life, it doesn't necessarily follow that there's something about divine life that must, by necessity, express itself in the other, as Rana's theology of the symbol postulates. That's why a second assumption is needed about John's theology, namely that the Logos as being with God, in 1 verse 1 and 2, entails a symbolic movement. Now, this is the inversion I mentioned a moment ago. For whereas John writes of the Logos as being towards or with God, and pros ton theon, Rana postulates the fundamental intra-divine relationship in terms of the Father's self-expression in the Son. But if these verses cannot bear the weight of Rana's symbolic reading, there is support forthcoming from a more extensive Johannine portrayal of intra-divine life, and this is found in Jesus' prayer. Now, Rana doesn't really refer to this, but I think he could have done if he'd wanted to justify his reading as a reading of John. In John 17, where Jesus has this famous prayer, we have an insight which is absolutely unparalleled anywhere in Scripture into the Father-Son interrelationship. Now, it's true that the absence of explicit reference to the Spirit here is in part the reason why some view the Gospel as espousing a kind of binitarian monotheism. However, this does not make the passage unfruitful for Trinitarian ontological reflections, as we'll see upon closer reflection. The most obvious feature of intradivine life described in John 17 is mutual glorification, also expressed as giving glory. But this phrase opens a window onto a more general feature of father-son interrelation, which is the preponderance of giving, signified by the frequent use of the verb didomi. In fact, the Father gives all things to the Son, so that Jesus states, everything of mine is yours, and everything of yours is mine. Now, we cannot think of this giving everything in terms of possessions that are somehow external to the Father. Through giving everything, the Father is giving the self, or to or into the other, the Son, which of course is consonant with what Rana describes as symbolic expression. Furthermore, because this giving into is the fundamental mode of intradivine relationship, and there's no other extrinsic means by which fatherhood can be conceptualized, we can say that the Father is Father precisely by virtue of this mutual giving with the Son, and vice versa. As such, divine identity is inherently relational, and there's no primal individual in Johannine thought. Being itself is therefore plural. And we can go a step further. The difference between Father and Son already provides a way to root the possibility of otherness, of the mundane sphere within intradivine relationship. And this is not only an abstract logical possibility. Instead, the Father's openness to the other takes in humanity itself. In Jesus' prayer, we can see this. It affirms the Rainerian continuity between intradivine life and the Logos' interaction with the world, through the way in which humanity is already involved in this giving and receiving. By this point, however, the absence of any reference to the Spirit in John 17 begins to become somewhat troubling. Can we really talk about the involvement of creation as the other in the father-son relationship whilst bypassing pneumatology? Now, different answers could be proposed to this quandary, and this quandary is indeed sharpened by the early concentration in the Gospel of John on the Paraclete. But for our purposes, Jesus' words right at the end of the prayer are vital. He says, "May the love with which you loved me be in them, and I also be in them." Here we have a third term. Love is not simply an attribute of the Father or the Son, or even just a verb, but an abstract noun, which Augustine, of course, latches onto in his reading and sees this as the bond of love. Sorry to Dr. Rojek, who I know doesn't like this. But whether we follow this or not, and my concern here is not particularly with the Gospel's Trinitarianism per se, love defines the Father-Son relationship in a way that must involve the Spirit, and crucially, is characterized by a moment of invitation, an invitation even beyond the Godhead, as we heard with the Victorines. Now, Rana says very little about love in this essay, and just as he says very little about the Spirit in this essay. But his focus on the term symbol can easily obscure the fact that self-giving into the other is, in the evangelist's terms, a matter of love. Hence, we could offer the following more Johannine formulation of Rana's symbolic ontology, as follows. God is a mutual glorification of Father and Son, involving the former's giving of self into the latter by love and spirit, through which the created world is formed and by which it is structured, so that people can also participate in intradivine life through symbolic actions or sacraments of love. So again, before we want to move on to exploring what such sacramental participation in Trinitarian ontology comprises, we need to make another key qualification, and this is where John pushes back somewhat against Rana. Talking in terms of love, rather than the more abstract symbolic function that Rana talks in terms of, brings us face to face with the reality that in the Gospel of John, the epitome of love is identified not with the intradivine life, but with Jesus' death on the cross. So, how can the continuity Rana draws between intradivine reality and the Logos' intercourse with the world be consistent with this cruciform shape of love? And the moment of eschatological disjunction it inevitably entails. Now, a larger challenge looms into view here, and this was one raised by Judith Wolff in the first NTO conference, and has already been mentioned by David Bennett today, which is that human temporality and mortality cannot simply be outpaced towards participation in plenitude, whether in knowledge or being. Participatory ontology is too often over-realized eschatology. So, does John have any response to this challenge levied against a Rainerian Trinitarian ontology? To answer in the affirmative, we need to redirect our focus once more towards divine being, and particularly the conundrum of how the death of Jesus relates to the eternal life of God. Herbert McCabe offers a compelling place to start with his analogy of a film that's distorted by having no silver screen on which to view it. I quote, "The story of Jesus is nothing other than the triune life of God projected onto our history, onto the rubbish dump that we have made of the world." By McCabe's reckoning, the intra-Trinitarian life of love, or its symbolic expression to use Rainerian terms, is only revealed in a distorted form in Jesus' life, with the crucifixion being the ugliest scene of all. Yet John is clear that there's actual glory in Jesus' sacrifice, hence his continuity with Greco-Roman ideas of honorable death for others. It's not just that self-giving as a general mode of action that is glorious, but the actual death. Hence, he gave up the spirit at the climax of his act. And this is glorious or even beautiful, again, as David Bennett has suggested. So how can we reconcile this with the fact that God is identified with life? How can we reconcile the glory of death with the identification of God with life? A clue comes in a parabolic saying of Jesus, whose significance has often been missed, and this is in John 12:24. He says, "Unless a grain of wheat falling to the ground dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Just as a seed, therefore, must die to bring life, so must the incarnated Logos die by very nature, and not only by virtue of mission." Now, this does not imply some kind of pre-fall human mortality, only that the flesh Jesus took on was inescapably mortal. As an ordinary man, the epitome of his love would be self-sacrifice in the kind of military heroic vein. But the Son of God goes beyond this, dying as a culmination of a perfect life of love to be the paschal Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Now, this death, though real, is not absolute cessation of the Son's being, and the resurrection signifies that the Father-Son relationship is unbroken. Hence, in John, Jesus nearly always refers to his return to the Father, and hardly ever refers to his death. Therefore, Raner's Trinitarian ontology of the symbol can, I think, be adapted to be better compatible with Johannine eschatology, whilst keeping its main contours intact. The symbolic expression of divine being as self-giving love is the life unto death of the Logos in the world. But what does it mean for the Church to continue this symbolic function? And now, as we come to conclude, we finally arrive at the question of praxis. Immediately, it should be clear that ethics, and not only sacraments, belong under the aegis of the symbolic engagement with the world that a Johannine Trinitarian ontology of cruciform love implies. It's not surprising, therefore, that the sole injunction in the Gospel of John is the command to love one another. But what does this mean? Well, firstly, on an individual basis, the command is premised not on an extant moral code, but on the life of Jesus. It's as Jesus loved them that the disciples are to love others, with the foot washing being the epitome of this love. And taking an ontological view of John allows us to see all of Jesus' life as self-giving love, which means that his signs are truly symbols of divine life in the Rainerian sense. And this is a real challenge to the consensus view that effectively separates the revelatory function of Jesus' signs from their ethical quality, often by focusing on their miraculous features, and thereby ridding them of their paradigmatic value for Christian practice as the result. But looking beyond an individual to a more corporate basis, we actually see that people are to love one another. Again, this is often missed in interpretation. It's not just that people are to love, but they are to be loved. They are to be passive recipients as well as active agents, which means they must establish a communal life in which divine life is lived. Love must therefore take a social form. And Rana's theology of the symbol is notably weak in this regard. And John is often thought to offer little by way of ecclesiology as well, yet alone politics. But again, the ontological view helps us here. Divine being in John is structured as a household or even a home. So if Heilsgeschichte is a matter of the Father, Son, and Paraclete drawing people to participate in this life as children of God, John 1:12, we can say at least something about John's social-political vision of love. And with this, I conclude. Johannine Trinitarian Ontology, as Rana helps us to see, entails the oikonomia of a divine home that is intimate and inviting, ordered and free. We could do worse than start by letting oikos be our guiding image, intensifying mutual love, both privately and nationally, and being more open to outsiders, not least those without families and people seeking refuge from violence. In such a politeia, life is a gift to be given for the other and not held with clenched fists. Kinship engenders radical inclusivity, and loyalty promotes honor for the other. And in a Europe shaped by Brexit, by COVID, and the refugee crisis, this is a message I think we desperately need. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for your paper. And now we have we will have the discussion of the two papers of Mr. Macek and Mr. Williams. I would say for 7 or 8 minutes, not more, up to 5:30. Then we directly begin with the last paper of Dr. Gaudiano, and I will omit or drop my concluding remarks more or less, only one or two sentences. First, yes.
Thank you. This is a question for the first paper. Thank you so much. I was curious if your, especially your initial words were very reminiscent to me of JP2's work on personalism, Thomism, and those sorts of things. And I just was wondering if you could speak to that further and if there's some connections you're pulling on to that tradition of Thomism for the proposal that you were bringing forward. Thank you.
All right. Does it work? Okay. So I think definitely, like, I was mostly referring to the work of Professor Pospíšil, and I think he was definitely influenced by the school of personalism, which was very much influenced in the Czech theological milieu of that time. So the answer here is yes. And as I said, he was born at the end of 1950s, so even historically or genealogically, he comes from the generation which was very much influenced by John Paul II. So, yes.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Okay, you both. Okay, first, Mr.
I have remarks on the political dimension of the Trinity. Since there is I think there is, it's very important for me, and I think it's really something which gives flavor for our interest in Trinity, that it might have some practical consequences in anthropology and also in political life. And well, my concern is that there are so many political interpretations of Trinity. For instance, theologian Leonardo Boff draws some socialistic conclusions, whereas Michael Novak, democratic liberalism, yes, and they are both claiming that they are just finding conclusion from the Trinitarian theology. I'm also well, I must confess that with my friends in Poland we published an issue of Cultural Journal after Benedict Caritas in Veritate, and we published a huge journal about a Trinitarian conclusion from Trinitarian theology for economics. and it was a disaster. And then we are criticized by liberals daily. So, and my question is, as far as I understand, Professor Pospisil is very well. He just gives negative statements about political order, and he does not propose a positive model. Is it true, or?
I absolutely agree that this issue of political implications of the Trinitarian doctrine are rather delicate, heavily nuanced. And maybe just the first point which comes into my mind is that, as yesterday Archbishop Williams was speaking about the role of tradition, and I think he mentioned Alistair McIntyre in his speech that the tradition in itself is contradictory. So I think that this idea that in the core of the Western or European tradition is the idea of the Trinity might be important for us, as I mentioned in my paper, as a kind of purification, or maybe as a kind of genealogical root of our tradition, but it shouldn't serve the purpose of a concrete political program or concrete political ideology. And I think this is the point of Professor Pospisil as well. I would say that he's pointing towards, as I mentioned in the paper, to use Trinitarian idea of God as a critique of monolithic totalitarian power. So I would say that he adopts this line of reasoning, but on the other hand, he's quite careful to push it too strongly, I would say.
Okay, thank you. It's one of the options.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is for Matt Williams and Jonas Nachi from Heidelberg, Germany. So I was very inspired by your talk, especially because in the Middle Ages, we already defined these thoughts in a way in a monastic setting. So in a monastic setting, we already have a theology of how the Trinity can serve as the principle of social living. For example, the Victrines, Ashar of St. Victor, has a sermon on the transfiguration of Christ, where he says that humans have to go through several transfigurations. And one of them is the highest one, or seemingly the highest, is to transform into God, or to transfigure into God and to become one with him in contemplation. But then he adds another transfiguration, which is the one of returning to your neighbor, where he says we have to become like Christ in the Eucharist. We have to become a sacrament to our neighbor. It's really interesting because sacrament then was not in a very strict sense that it is now, but it was basically a Latin word for symbol. So in a way, the sacramental theology of at least the 12th century, in the 13th it turns a bit stricter, I think, but at least the 12th century is very much on par with what you said today.
Thanks for that. What else? Oh, am I still recording? Maybe someone can me up. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, well, I'll say to that, just to add, and I'll maybe send you an email to ask you for some of these references. But it's interesting that, of course, there's no transfiguration in the Gospel of John. But what we have is the foot washing. And the foot washing is perhaps the main interface between sacramental and ethical engagement, because it's impossible to separate the ethical interpretation of the foot washing as an example from its sacramental and ritualized practice. As soon as you try to have one without the other, I think you end up losing both. So thanks for that. And I would just point to the foot washing as the way sacramental and ethical implications come together in John.
Okay.
Hi, Matt. This is David Bennett from Oxford University. Thank you so much for your paper. I absolutely loved it, and the creativity of weaving New Testament exegesis and Rana's symbol off the back of what we've just been discussing. I wanted to ask you about aesthetics and beauty as well, because you brought that up. Specifically related to kind of the horror of the cross how something like that could be like paradoxically so beautiful, and how glory functions in the Gospel of John, and also how Rana is using symbol, which is an aesthetic term, which relates back to kind of knowing beauty in some way, or finding order again after kind of trauma. I was just wondering if you could comment on that, kind of how glory is understood as something that seems to be found in such a negative and horrific experience in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And yeah, it's certainly not simple. It's a cop-out way to start an answer, but I think it's not simple. And you really have the fathers wrestle with this. For example, Augustine, in one of his tractates, talks about the fact that the glory of the cross is in the resurrection. And you get a strong strain of thought, I guess, which doesn't really see any inherent glory in the cross itself, or even in death itself, but either in the resurrection or in what it symbolizes more abstractly about the self-giving mode of intradivine life. And so how do we really find it in the cross itself? And I think that certainly there's not a graphic and explicit description of Jesus dying in John. So I think whatever's going on, the beauty is not in literally a graphically portrayed, bloodied Jesus in that certain way. Yet we know that's happening. And I think to me anyway, through meditating on this somewhat, I think the glory comes precisely in the fact that as this is clearly going on, as there's clearly a naked man who's streaming with blood and straining for breath, he gives up the spirit. And to be able to see that action of intentionality and love amidst what was manifestly a horrific incident, I think is profoundly and transformatively beautiful, actually. And that's probably where I'd start, but it's certainly no simple matter.
Ryan Haecker from the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much, Matt William, for a brilliant presentation. You had mentioned previously the materiality of mundane experience being transformed and communicated by the church. One theme that has been raised repeatedly in our panel today has been the way in which the economic trinity is an imitation of the processional relations that are grounded in the immanent trinity. And that extends, of course, even to matter and the way in which matter is a vehicle for symbols. What I want to ask is whether you think you could extend Bronner's analysis of the symbol or of the sacrament to a digital theology of computational or virtual spaces. The reason I ask this is because you had described how the divine difference of the Son from the Father allows us in our symbolic expressions to participate in the interdivine relations of God as Trinity. What's really fascinating about this is that, as Marshall McLuhan once said, the medium is the message. And the medium of digital communication is something that's imminently differentiated. It's what you might describe as a sort of infinitely differentiated mechanical motion that is recombined in different calculations of different symbolic expressions in virtual arrays. Now, what changes about this then is that in as far as the medium is imminently differentiated, it seems to image this immanent difference that proceeds at every level of reality unto the lowest level of mechanism, but then that can be recombined as it's calculated in new virtual displays. And I wonder if you think that Bronner's interpretation of the symbol as a sacrament is more readily interpreted within this medium of digital communication, precisely because the symbol is not simply a sign that's deferred over a difference, but that is itself sort of constituted within the differentiation of matter itself.
Yeah, I wish I didn't have to answer this question. That's a hard question, and I have to admit I haven't thought about that specifically. This is one of those issues which, for me, and I'm sure many other people, has probably come first as a practical question during the COVID pandemic in terms of how we engage with church, and maybe second as a theoretical one. I think probably I couldn't answer this without bringing in reference to the word, because of course the word is something which I've not talked about at all, really, and Brandon doesn't talk about very specifically in his essay on symbol. But I think if we're going to understand the digital aspects of things in relation to our symbolic participation in divine life, I think we need to see probably more the way in which digital communication interfaces with word, and how word functions through digital communication. Because I don't know if you can really understand it in the kind of quasi-electronic differentiations that it goes through in quite the same way as you can actual material participation. I'd be very hesitant to say, yes, it's just another mode of differentiated material participation. I would be happy with saying that you can understand it more in terms of the function of the word, but that's certainly not something I've thought about much, and you would probably have a clearer sense of that than I would.
So thank you so much both to you, Mr. Macek and Mr. William, for your lectures, for your answers. We have to conclude this session for reasons of time and this section.